Next up, we have somewhat of a heroine in Kenya, as many of you know, Wangu Kanja. Are you here, Wangu? Where are you? I also first met Wangu and her colleague Lisa, Professor Lisa Smith, who's joining us online too. Many months ago during COVID, we had the opportunity actually of meeting so many people. And then I was able to meet Wangu in person a few months ago. And this lady is a lady Wangu Kanja, and has been really honored by other countries for the work that she's done, as well as revered in Kenya. As a survivor of sexual violence herself, she has taken that trauma and turned it into hope for survivors, has done incredible work in the space in Kenya, the Gendered Violence Recovery Center, that she works with, the funding and the donations that she procures in order to help survivors. And the work that herself and Professor Lisa Smith from the University of Leicester, who will be joining her in the second part of the presentation virtually, is really, for me, so innovative. And it shows how, when you look at the challenging circumstances and the low resource environments within Africa, how we don't have to use what's being used throughout the world. We can change things to work in our environments. And they really are leading the way in this particular cause. And what they're going to be presenting on today, I think everybody outside of Kenya should really take notice, as well as South Africa if you're tuning in, because we have a lot to learn from the incredible developments they have in terms of sexual collection kits, evidence collection. And we always say we can have the best laws in place, we can have the best policies in place, we can have the best laboratories in place. If you can't get collection right, you can't even get off the starting blocks. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today. Thank you for your courage, for being a crusader, and the stage is all yours. Thank you, Wangu. So we'll just
hi everyone. So for me, I'll speak towards support to survivors of sexual violence. And this is informed by my own personal experience in 2002 after going through a rape ordeal and the challenges that I faced in the hands of family, friends, community, service providers. So I am using my own personal experience to work towards restoring dignity to survivors of sexual violence. And that's how Wangu Kanja Foundation was born. But also under Wangu Kanja Foundation, we convene the Survivors of Sexual Violence in Kenya network, which has both men and women, because we recognize that also men go through rape. And one of the things that we try to do as much as possible is to help policymakers, service providers to understand that we need to have interventions that are survivor-centered, but also that are trauma-informed. And I will speak towards the DNA evidence kit that we developed in partnership with University of Leicester. Because one of the things that we've realized is survivors, when they go to hospital, we conduct medical examinations without giving them information on what's going to happen. And in that process, we are re-traumatizing them. It's uncomfortable for some of the survivors because medical doctors have to use a speculum to actually collect the high vaginal swab. So can you imagine someone has been raped, they have tear cuts and abrasions, and you're using a speculum to collect, because we tell them, please present to hospital within 72 hours. Either the inflammation or the cuts will not have healed by that time they're presenting at the hospital. So we are trying to look for practical solutions for survivors so that they are not re-victimized, re-traumatized, but also at the end of the day, they are comfortable and they feel that their dignity is also restored within the continuum of care. Because most of the time we come up with the interventions without acknowledging that you are actually, developing these interventions for a human being. Survivors of sexual violence have a face, and they are human beings. They are human beings. So we need to understand that at the end of the day, bring survivors to the table, listen to them, hear their voices, understand where they are coming from, because at the end of the day, the reality is we need to help them access justice. And looking at also, we facilitate survivors to get to the hospitals. We collect the high vaginal swabs, but then unfortunate bit, then it is never used in their cases. That means we are denying survivors access to justice. But then also we are denying the people who are wrongfully identified, we are denying them exoneration, because DNA can be used to either confirm that this is the person who committed this crime, but also eliminate the people who have been wrongfully identified or mistaken identities by either a survivor at that particular time. She didn't get to see their face well, but then at some point identified the wrong person. And by doing so, we will improve every single day. We will improve access to justice for survivors. Let's not deny survivors access to justice, but by not including use of DNA evidence in their cases. So I'll hand over to my colleague Lisa, so that she can take us through the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Wangu. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm so sorry to not be able to be in Nairobi with you. I desperately miss visiting Kenya, having not been able to be there since just before COVID kicked off, but I hope that I will be able to be there again soon. Just before I tell you about this program of research, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's a very interdisciplinary project, and all of the things that we're talking about at this symposium really do need a very interdisciplinary and multi-sector approach, because these are very complex kind of societal and legal and criminal justice and scientific issues. So we really do have to all come together to tackle the successful investigation and prosecution of sexual and gender-based violence. And so I think that this symposium that, Vanessa has led on bringing together it's absolutely crucial for us to all be in the same room discussing these things. So in terms of this project, the core project team was led by myself and Wangu, but it involved colleagues from the University of Leicester who are experts in forensic genetics. So Mark and John both work in the genetics department at the University of Leicester. We also had a research associate on the project called Jessica Ritchie, who's in criminology with me at the university. And then we also had colleagues at Kenyatta University, so Dr. Richard Ordur, who's the main contact there. And then as the project developed, of course, we built lots of other partnerships outside the core team. So for example, the GVRC, who became a really key partner in the project, Marian Matugi, who I think is with you at the symposium today, who was previously at Amref University and is now working with the Kenya Human Rights Commission. We had KEMRI, which is the Kenya Medical Research Institute. So I think Eva's joined online. So the partnerships really grew over the last 5 years or so. And just to kind of highlight the importance of those partnerships in any projects like this. So I'm not going to say too much about this slide, because I think, luckily, because we rejigged the speakers, Ashley's already given us a really good overview of many of the reasons for this significant underreporting of cases of sexual and gender-based violence. And even those who do report their incidents of sexual violence, this kind of cycle that's on the screen now is not exclusive to low resource environments. And by low resource environments, I mean, this could be countries that are lacking in investment and infrastructure for forensics and policing. It could be very remote locations where people struggle to get access to medical facilities. It could be conflict and post-conflict settings, as we were just hearing in the DRC. It could be humanitarian emergencies like natural disasters, informal settlements, displaced communities. There's all kinds of what we are considering to be low resource environments. And so this cycle here on your screen is not exclusive to low resource environments, but it's made a lot worse in low resource environments. So you see the really significant underreporting of crime that we've already heard about from Ashley. So thank you, Ashley, for preempting that bit. I can skip that a little. But what we also see is a real lack of capacity to investigate cases. So even where somebody does come forward to engage with the criminal justice process, a real lack of capacity to investigate crimes. And that includes a lack of capacity to properly collect and preserve and analyze, for example, DNA evidence. That, of course, feeds into very low prosecution rates. So even where people are reporting and they're having investigations started, they often don't progress to a prosecution. And even if they do, they tend to not be very successful very often. And of course, what that does is it sends a message that people are not held accountable for these kinds of crimes. So you get a culture of impunity. So people, basically a lack of confidence in the criminal justice response. And of course, what that means is that there's no deterrence for offending. So there's nothing acting to stop people from further committing these crimes. And this really is a cycle that perpetuates itself and continues until you start to do work to break that cycle. So this presentation is really going to focus on the collection of DNA evidence after a case of sexual violence, which is, of course, only a very small part of the puzzle, but you have to start somewhere. And I think what I would like to highlight is that the collection of evidence is really key because it's your first port of call, if you will, for being able to provide DNA evidence to support access to justice. So if you don't get collection right and preservation right, the DNA evidence just doesn't go anywhere and it doesn't assist the survivor. So really the research challenge that Wangu and myself and the team set ourselves was trying to improve prosecution rates for sexual violence in low resource environments through improving access to high quality forensic evidence. And so what we were trying to do was use some research and innovation to develop some new evidence collection methods that were specifically going to be tailored to the challenges in the Kenyan setting, because that's where this pilot project took place. And so the overarching aim there as well is to empower survivors through access to evidence and then to break that cycle that I just showed you. So that should, in the longer term, increase confidence in the criminal justice response, encourage reporting, and facilitate successful prosecutions. So just to give you a quick overview of the state of things when we first started the project. So this was back in, I guess, 2017 or so. We had a small grant to spend some time in Kenya kind of scoping out what the current practice was. And what I would want to start off by saying is that we visited a lot of clinics, different levels of clinic across, mainly in Nairobi, but a little bit outside of Nairobi as well. And we saw some really excellent work going on and really excellent will from clinicians and from obviously organizations like Wangu's to support the collection of DNA evidence. So that was really great to see. But some of the things we also noted was a lack of good practice in preservation of evidence and in packaging and chain of custody of DNA evidence. And what this was leading to was feedback from the police, for example, and the government chemist, that if the quality of the samples being collected and the integrity of those samples was not to a high enough standard, then actually it was perceived to be wasting time to collect those samples from the hospital and pass them on for analysis, because it's adding to a big backlog and you're ending up with lots of samples that are sitting in a backlog but are actually not of the integrity that you need to support a prosecution. And so there was a real lack of engagement from the police in collecting samples from clinics and passing them on to the lab. So some of the problems that we and the challenges that we identified in integrity was, for example, the drying of swabs in clinics. So you can see a picture here of a drying cabinet in a clinic, which was very common. A lot of them looked exactly like this. And you can see swabs from different cases being dried in an open, accessible cabinet right next to each other. And of course, the drying of the samples is crucial for making sure that they don't degrade before they're packaged. But of course, this method of drying leaves you open to the potential for tampering of samples, for human error, and just general contamination, cross-contamination between different cases. The other thing we noted was a lot of the swabs that were being provided to clinics are of this type with the wooden shaft, which can be a bit dangerous to use because it can splinter and it can break. So one of the things in our DNA kits that we introduced was a plastic shaft instead of the wooden shaft. And the other thing that we noticed as well was with the packaging and storage of samples. So you can see the picture on the right is a very typical situation that we saw at lots of clinics where samples were being refrigerated, which is fine, but stored in just paper bags, sealed with a piece of tape with details written on it. And again, this leaves potential for things to be tampered with, or just no continuity of that evidence and chain of custody. So you can see here that there was a couple really quick wins that we felt we could have in helping clinics with the packaging and the drying of samples. So what we developed in this work, working alongside clinics and Wangu Kanja Foundation and the Survivors of Sexual Violence Network, is a different approach to the packaging of DNA evidence collection kits for use in the clinics. So what you can see here is the contents of a pilot kit that we developed together, and it tackles some of those main challenges that I just highlighted in the previous slide. So the first difference, what you have in each kit is a pair of gloves. So it's a pair of disposable gloves that can be used by the clinician. But also the key thing is really the packaging of the swab and the evidence bag that the swabs are stored in. So you can see, hopefully, I don't know how clear it is, but I think the slides will be shared. The swabs on the right, they're in a plastic tube, like they would normally come, and they can be opened and used and then put back into the tube. And the black end of the tube, once the swab, the used swab, so the vaginal swab, for example, has been used in an examination, it's put back in the tube, and the black end, which isn't attached to the swab, then pops off, which allows the swab to dry within the tube. So the swab no longer has to sit in that open air cabinet to dry. It can dry itself in the tube because air can flow through it. Once it's packaged like that, the swab in the tube with one end popped off can go directly into the evidence bag that you can see in the middle of that picture. And the key thing with this evidence bag is that it breathes. So one side of the bag is plastic and has a series of boxes that can be filled out to maintain chain of custody and information about case number, that sort of thing. But the back of the bag, which you can't see in this picture, is a material that allows air to permeate through it. So what it means is that the swab can be put into the tube, dried within the tube, inside this bag, which is sealed with a tamper evident seal. And what the tamper evident seal does is it ensures that the bag cannot be reopened without it being evident that it's been broken into. So the risk of human tampering, the risk of tampering with the evidence is much less likely than storing them in those paper bags that we saw in the previous picture. The other thing that we explored is the possibility of these kits, which are really, really easy to use, being used in a self-examination, a supervised self-examination model. So Wangu was talking about the re-traumatization that's experienced by survivors going through a medical examination shortly after their experience of sexual violence. And there is the possibility, and I'll talk about this in a moment, there is the possibility of survivors being able to do their own intimate swabs under supervision by following a very clear set of instructions. So just to quickly run through the Kenya pilot project, there was a couple of different strands to the project. So we developed the pilot kits that you just saw, and we also launched a training and capacity building program. Now, I should say that this project unfortunately kicked off right at the same time in early 2020 as COVID became an issue that we all had to deal with. So it was significantly disrupted, and I'm really, really grateful to our partners in Kenya for helping us keep the project up and running whilst the team from the UK was unable to travel to Kenya. So we had to end up doing a train the trainer and online methods for the training and capacity building. But we had participants from the Kenya Survivors Network, from healthcare, police, the judiciary, NGOs and human rights defenders, training them on the basic principles of DNA evidence collection and the various improvements to practice that the pilot kits could make to clinics in Kenya. And the next stage of that was a pilot in some clinics across Nairobi. So we had funding to distribute DNA kits to the participating clinics, including many GVRC clinics, trying to work with the clinicians to integrate the pilot kits into their existing practice. So this was not a project that was about completely reinventing how things were done, but rather it was to complement what the great work that the clinics were already doing in their medical examinations, and to explain to them the improvements to the drying and the packaging of samples. So big thanks to GVRC clinics for enabling us to pilot the kits in the clinics. And the other thing that we did was a pilot study with some volunteers from Kenya. So these were volunteer couples in Kenya, so men and women who were in relationships already, who volunteered to use the kits in a self-examination setting after consensual, unprotected sexual intercourse. So these were couples who agreed to use the kits, trying to follow the instructions that we developed with Wangu to see how successful the kits could be when people were actually using them themselves. So this wasn't in a medical setting, this was in their own homes. And big thank you to Kemri and Eva in particular for leading on the analysis of those swabs that were sent back from our 59 volunteer couples. And we're just in the process of writing up that paper, so that will be published shortly. But the results basically showed us that we were able to recover the male DNA profile and profile it back, match it back to the male partner in those relationships to a very similar rate as we would expect to see in swabs recovered in a medical setting if they were recovered in a timely fashion after an incident of sexual violence. The other work that happened alongside of this as well was working with Richard at Kenyatta University mainly, and Marion as well, on developing a DNA reference database for Kenya. So this is an important step to assist with the interpretation of samples. So we presented this finding to the government chemist. So we had 510 male volunteers who were generated through Kenyatta University, who provided a DNA sample along with information about their ethnic origin, their language, their birthplace, about themselves, their parents, and their grandparents, which enabled us to look at variation in profiles based on region and language across Kenya. So that paper has been published. I'm very happy to give any of the geneticists in the audience a link to that after the session. And finally, we've also done a mapping activity of 5 other countries. So this was done in collaboration with a global law firm who did this work for us pro bono, mapping out the legislation and forensic DNA capacity in the DRC, Malawi, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia. Again, just to give us a sense of the state of play in those 5 areas, with a view to thinking about how these pilot kits or similar kits might be able to be integrated beyond Kenya. So I just wanted to finish off with a really brief, before I pass back to Wangu to wrap up, just a really brief view of how we're looking forward with this project. So the pilot project in Kenya and the funding associated with that has come to an end now, and we're in the process of writing up all of our findings for dissemination. I think in the short to medium term, one thing that I would like to see is scaling up of manufacturing capacity on the African continent. With the pilot kits we used for this project, they were manufactured in the UK, and then we had to ship them over to Nairobi to Wangu for distribution, which increases the costs quite a lot. It delays everything. You can imagine during COVID, the shipping of the kits was very slow and difficult. So I think there is a real need for not just these kits, but manufacturing of forensic recovery and evidence recovery products in Africa to bring the costs down. Ashley had a call to arms for investment, and I think that's the theme really of this slide. I know Wangu would definitely say that what we need is sustainable funding for making evidence kits available across Kenya, resourcing of the police to enable them to collect the kits and pass them on to the government chemist. Of course, resourcing of the government chemist itself, because if you increase the capacity to collect evidence, you need to increase the capacity to analyze it. What we really also need, and I know Wangu is already doing lots of great work on this front, is building a consortium of healthcare, justice and security sectors committed to working together to push forward forensic DNA across Kenya and beyond. And continuing to build research into links between sexual and gender-based violence and other high priority government issues, such as national security. Again, that will help the flow of resources as well. And I think longer term, what we're interested in doing, of course, is tracking our pilot kits beyond the use in the clinics to see, do they end up going out for analysis? Do they end up being featuring in prosecutions, and what positive impact they have in that kind of ecosystem I showed you at the beginning. Of course, sustainable funding for further training is also really important. So keeping the capacity up across the country, perhaps piloting similar projects in other low resource environments, be that other countries or humanitarian settings. And really, I think the main thing is sustainable investment in infrastructure. I know Wangu and I are constantly frustrated by, you get a sudden influx of investment for a project, but when that comes to an end, it comes to an end, and there doesn't seem to be much sustainable funding for keeping these projects going longer term. So I think at that stage, I'm going to pass back to Wangu, who just wanted to finish on a recap of this slide. So I'll call Wangu back to the podium to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So we have the kits with us, and we are trying to do advocacy as much as possible for people to buy into the idea, because we need to work towards restoring dignity to survivors. And this is one of the many ways we can start restoring dignity to survivors. Because at the end of the day, the most important person, while we are trying to do what we are trying to do, access to justice, offer comprehensive care and support, is to make sure that the person, the individual who has been affected, is at the heart of the conversation. So we cannot stop having conversations with the different service providers, because the individual needs to heal, but also they need to access justice. But the most important bit of it is that they need to feel empowered, because when you go through sexual violence, your dignity is taken away. And there are certain measures that we can put in place to make sure that that person's dignity is restored. And this is one of them. So I'm hoping that moving forward, we'll find easier, practical ways to support survivors of sexual violence. Thank you.
Such a warrior. Here's your present. Hang on. Thank you for everything you do. Don't stop doing what you do, please. Thank you. I'm sure you'll all agree that these ladies have done a phenomenal job with their team. I know in South Africa, we have got a box in terms of a collection kit that has got so many parts on it that the doctors actually and the forensic nurses don't even know half the time which things are supposed to be used where. There's so much wastage. There's such an expense and a drain on our resources in respect to these kits. We need to make them more modular. We need to follow their example. And I really encourage everybody to get in touch with both Lisa and Wangu, and let's take this project forward. There must be manufacturers in the East African community we can do this in Africa, that can produce these kits. And we must be able to make them available in our various rape crisis centers. It just makes so much sense. And thank you so much for the work that you do. And thank you, Lisa, if you can still hear us. I'm still here. Of meeting Lisa in person recently in the UK. Your passion, I'm so sorry for various reasons Lisa wasn't able to be here, but we will be back in Kenya together, and we look forward to having you here. And thank you for the incredible work that you are doing over there for the East African community, and we look forward to taking this project forward. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? We're running a bit out of time, but if there are any questions, we can take maybe one from anybody. Otherwise, please get in touch with Wangu at lunchtime. The next speaker, Dr. Kizzy Shaker.
One question.
Oh, sorry, the light is blinding me. I'm really sorry.
Thank you. First of all, I'd just like to express the huge respect that I have for the Wangu Kanja Foundation and also for yourself in the work that you're doing in terms of improving outcomes in cases of sexual assault. I just wanted to address two questions to you, Wanja, and maybe the speaker who is online. I noticed that the kit is focused a lot on collection of higher vaginal swabs, if I'm not wrong. How do you address, I know practitioners in the room who have recovered evidence, not from HVSs, but from other sample types like maybe pubic hair or undergarments. Do you feel the kit maybe misses out on a bit of the other sample types that you may be able to recover DNA evidence from? And do you have a provision maybe to address that in the context of additional components in the packaging? And secondly, I just generally wanted to understand, how does self-collection fit in the context of the criminal justice system insofar as admissibility of that evidence which has been collected by the victim go in actually getting an outcome in court? Thank you.
Do you want me to take that, Vanessa, or Wangu? I don't.
Thank you, John. Lisa, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your questions. So your first question about components of the kit. Yes, you're absolutely right. There are, of course, lots of other evidence collection opportunities. This particular pilot focused just on the high vaginal swabs, as you pointed out, and that was a deliberate redesign of just that part of a wider rape kit. Vanessa's point was a really good one about kind of a more modular approach to kits. I totally agree that that is the way forward for the reasons you mentioned, Vanessa. A lot of wastage, a lot of extra cost. I mean, some of those kits cost upwards of 50 euros a piece, whereas, you know, just this module of a kit you can do for under $5 US. So it is a massive difference. So I think what would be ideal is if you designed a series of modules packaged separately that clinicians could, you know, take off a shelf and use a module where it's appropriate and not have to open a big box of 10 different modules and throw away 9 of them, if you know what I mean. So absolutely, other modules can be developed and should be developed, but we were working just on one module for this project. The second question about self-examination, I know, Vanessa, you're running out of time, and this is quite a long question to answer. The short answer is, we've not tested self-examination in a criminal justice setting yet. It's a bit of an idea that we've been discussing for a number of years with different stakeholders. It's a bit controversial for the reasons that you mentioned. You need to get it right, and it needs to still tick all of the legal requirements in terms of chain of custody and integrity, which is why we're thinking of a supervised self-examination module approach. So giving a survivor potentially the opportunity to do much of the exam themselves, but under supervision from a medical practitioner who can then sort of state that they were there. It was that person who did it at this time and date, etc. So it's a bit controversial, but it does open up a world of access to survivors and quite a lot of empowerment. So I think it's a conversation that's worth having. I'll leave it there for now, but we could always pick it up offline because it is quite a long topic. And I don't want you to run over, Vanessa.
Thank you. I do think it's almost a workshop in itself, and I know that there are definitely going to be people in this room that might want to take it up again. I certainly want to have the conversation even in South Africa, and I think that there's a lot of scope for further engagement. Thank you for your time, Lisa. Hope to see you soon. Thank you, Wangu, as always, for your dedication and commitment to helping survivors. Thank you.